All right, in this brief video, I'm going to show you the new event-based flows, which are new in version 2.4 of the product. So what event-based flows are, they're flows that trigger when an event occurs. That could be a message over MQTT or Webhook, it could be data over OPC UA, etc. So if you remember historically in HighByte, flows would poll data. So we'd go and poll the MQTT input, and if data was coming in fast, you'd have to poll fairly quick. You'd have to make the flow poll pretty quick to try to not miss data, but it wasn't guaranteed. If you got 1,000 messages over a second, we were going to miss some of those messages. With event-based flows, you don't miss any, right? So those messages immediately trigger the flow. They also queue up in front of the flow, so the flow will guarantee to process each message. Then the flow logic can be the same. You can mix the data, match it, you can model it, and then send it out, but you're doing it based on events and not off polling. All right, so to demo this, I'm going to do two things. The first thing is I'm going to create a flow that triggers off a webhook to go generate a bunch of data and publish it to the UNS. The second thing I'm going to do is once I have that set up, I'm going to create another flow that listens in on the UNS on that topic, pulls in all the messages because they're generated over a very short window, and then sends those out to CSV so you can see that all the data is maintained and it's all event-based. All right, so to start, what I did is I've got a little bit of project configuration here. Let me just refresh. I've got an MQTT connection to my local Mosquito broker. And in here, I've got an output that I'm going to send my data out. And I'm going to separate it by motor ID. So you'll see that in the data payload. I also have an input, and this is when I'm going to read the data back in on that topic. So to generate the data, that's kind of the first thing. I'm not actually going to go wire into real data. I'm going to use templating to create a really simple data set. So here I have a motor, speed, vibration, etc., motor ID. What I've done is I've created an instance, and in the instance, I'm actually not wired into any real data, right? I've just got defaults, and then I'm replacing the motor ID down here, and then I'm controlling the number of instances I generate based off this parameter setting. So if you went into the template settings, you'd see, all the instances that are generated in each one. So this is just a way to really quickly generate, 100 in this case, pieces of data. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create an events-based flow. So I'm going to say to UNS, I'm going to take my templated instance, this is all 100 motors, and I'm going to output that to my MQTT output, which has the topic delineated by motor ID. Now, by default, it's polled mode, right? So I'm just going to sit here and poll for some input, but I'm going to set it into event mode. And what I didn't show you is I created a webhook input. So I have a webhook input that just listens for any message that comes in over on a port 9001, and I'm going to use that to trigger the flow. So what this says is anytime I get a message over the webhook asynchronously, I'm going to trigger the flow immediately for that message. In this case, I'm just using the webhook as a trigger, right? There's no data in the webhook that I'm going to use in my flow logic. I could, but in this case, it's totally independent. I'm just using it as a trigger for the flow. Now, I could also put different modes. I could use on change or on true to say, this is going to do anytime I get a message, but I could say anytime I get a different message, or there's some logic I want to apply to the message. All of that still works. And then I'm going to publish everything up. So I'm going to turn this flow on. And by default, this flow is going to do nothing, right? Because it's waiting for a message. And if I go in and clear out, I was doing some testing before the video, clear out, there's no data being published to the UNS. So I have postmon. I'm just going to send a post request to 9001, and this will trigger the flow immediately, right? Because it's just waiting for any message to be delivered. So as long as I get a 200 back, which I did, the flow has triggered. It's going to go read all 100, generate all 100 motors and then generate that data out. You can see the count here is 100, meaning it resulted in 100 unique publishes. So now I have my data generator, right? And it's not doing anything, and then if I send it again, this will jump up to 200. It's generating that data. So now let's pull it back in. So what I'm going to do now is create another flow that's going to say UNS to CSV. And similarly, I'm going to pull in my MQTT input. So I'm listening for the data I just generated. And I'm going to output that to CSV. And I just have I'm just dumping it to a CSV file. There's no magic configuration there. In a similar way, I'm going to make this event-based. So I'm going to make it based on the event of the data. So as soon as I get any message in over this topic, I'm going to trigger this flow. Again, in my flow, I'm just going to take the raw input and dump it out to CSV, but I could model it. I could send it through custom conditions, you name it. All that still works. But the flow triggering is going to be based on the new event data coming in. So I'm going to turn this on. And by default, I'm outputting to this CSV directory. I think I have an old file in here, but if I delete this and refresh, there's no data, nothing's happening. So now to trigger this, it's a chain reaction, right? I'm going to post to the webhook. That's going to trigger the generation of data, and then I'm going to consume each event that I published, and then one by one write those out to CSV. So what I should end up with, if I did my homework, a single press of this button should end up being 100 rows in the CSV file. So I'm going to hit send. We'll go out to CSV. So the first flow triggered, second flow pulled that back in, each event. And if I open up this file, it's not in order because the ordering gets messed up when it goes through the broker. But you can see there's 101. It's one base. I think the first row is the header. But you can see all those messages end up in there. Now, if I jump back to Postmon, hit send again, I'm going to have to close this file. Open this up. Now there should be 201. And there is not. I might have caused a failure having the file open. Let me try to close it and then do it. It happens pretty quick. There you go, now 201. So yeah, I bet you if I went and looked at my logs, you would have seen some write failures. It's being opened by another, look at that, opened by another process. Wow. Awesome. So anyway, you can see this kind of mass event-based flows. There's a lot of use cases for these where polling, you could potentially miss data. Now use event-based flows in those use cases, and you can guarantee you'll get every message. The flow will trigger on every message and process that through the system. So give that a shot.